Welcome everyone. Today we have with us Max. Max joining us from LinkedIn. I have had a pleasure to know Max for now a lot of time and have learned so much from Max's experience working in all the different companies. And I'll probably not do justice introducing Max. So, Max, why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure. So, a brief overview of my career is once upon a time, I was the chief architect of the Bugzilla project. I published two books, one called Code Simplicity with O'Reilly and another called Understanding Software with Pact. Then I was the tech lead of Code Health at Google. And now I am one of the technical leads for developer productivity and happiness at LinkedIn.
Amazing. So Max is probably one of the most experienced person understanding about code health and evolution of code. And more recently, LinkedIn has also published a framework called Developer Productivity and Happiness Framework. And we will be spending most of the time discussing those details. So maybe Max, I would love to at least have you introduce what does developer productivity and happiness even mean. I have not heard of this term, especially from anywhere outside of LinkedIn. So share a bit about like DPH. Where does that philosophy come from?
Sure. So obviously, in every business, it's important to have productivity. Everybody wants to be able to produce products effectively and efficiently. Side note: most people don't define productivity very well unless they have trouble measuring it or understanding it. That the thing I just said is the definition: effective and efficient. Um, but what they miss is that there's a subjective component that is very important in measuring and understanding developer productivity and in actually being effective as a business. I think people hear happiness in there and they think, what is this, Charlie in the Chocolate Factory? Like, you just want to give everybody, why don't you just give everybody all the time off and then they'll be happy? Like, so some people are more hard nosed about this. And, some people in the world, I've had people tell me like, I don't care if my employees are happy. And, okay, first of all, like, I do actually care. Like, just to be clear, like, it's not all just hard nosed business talk. Like, I want people to be happy. Like, work is what people do with most of their lives, and I would like for them to enjoy it. But if you do care about, what are the outcomes here, happy people are more productive, and productive people are more happy. And if you have unhappy people, very often that actually is going to impede their productivity. Look, sometimes in the short term, you're going to do something, it's going to be unpleasant, but it's necessary. But if you're unhappy persistently over a long period of time, it's hard to imagine that you're staying as productive as you really could be at work.
Interesting. So is there a place where productivity and happiness may conflict with each other? I would imagine if you focus on one, the other one should come in alongside.
Theoretically, yes, they should. I can think of a few different types of situations, though, in which it's important to think of those two concepts separately. One of them is that it's very easy for people to think of productivity as just what quantity of thing did you produce? Did you produce enough of this thing? Like, like you're sitting there in the widget factory, and I want last week you produced 50 widgets, and this week you got to produce 51. You know, but if you went, but let's say like the worker's really unhappy. He's produced 51 widgets. Next week he's produced 52, and he's really unhappy. And you go to find out, why are you unhappy? Not like just as a person, but like with your work. And he says, because the widget machine is broken and I'm doing all of this production by like brute force. See, like, wow, that's like a huge insight for you. All of a sudden you're like, oh my gosh, if I invest into fixing this machine, all of a sudden I actually get 100 widgets a week. Or he says, I make all these widgets, but they're terrible and they're all going to break. And you're like, oh, like, and theoretically, yes, like that's a violation of productivity because, productivity is efficient and effective. And if you're not producing a quality product, that's not effective. That's not an effective production process. But if many people just think of productivity as just raw output, and if you think of it as just raw output, you're going to miss. And so adding in this happiness component also, in addition to the fact that, like I legitimately care about people being happy, um, actually helps you catch aspects of productivity that you otherwise wouldn't catch.
Is there a opposite side of this as well, where developers are happy but they're not productive?
That's pretty rare. I have never encountered that.
So technically, your organization could be developer happiness. But okay, let's dive into your DPH framework. So for somebody who's never listened to or like heard about this, maybe you can share high level what the what was the goal behind creating a framework? Like what does it provide to people?
Sure. So about 5 years ago, my boss, Jared Green, who is actually a pretty amazing and visionary developer productivity leader, came to me and he said, "You are now in charge of a team that does insights and feedback for developers. You're now the tech lead of that team." And I said, "Okay." And then we took a bunch of engineers from different parts of the developer productivity team, and we formed a whole new director level organization with a me paired with a director. And uh, I needed to provide guidance to the engineers. Some of them had some data background, some of them had some experience in this, but I had the most. And so I needed to write down everything that I knew as much as I could about how to measure and understand and improve developer productivity effectively. And I also needed to set out what our goals, signals, and metrics would be. One of the concepts that is covered in this thing. Um, and so the foundation of the documents that I published are the documents that I wrote for the team, uh, especially the ones that I wrote early on. And then as time went on, additional guidance was required. We would see common patterns. We would update our concepts, and we also wrote a ton of metrics definitions, like actual definitions for metrics. And we learned a lot about how to write metrics definitions, how to define metrics, how to implement metrics along the way. And every time we'd learn that, I would try to keep it in a document somewhere. And so that's the genesis or the basis of the framework, and its purpose is to help anybody who needs to understand how to measure developer productivity and how to understand developer productivity understand how to do that.
Interesting. And you've also worked at Google previously, where you also helped build some of the code review guidelines. Does your DPS framework, is it like very specific for LinkedIn experience, or do you think it's catered like it's kind of like inspired from Google as well?
Um, I have a community of researchers that I interact with from across the entire software industry, especially from all of the major tech companies. We all communicate and collaborate, um, and so it's actually based on a combination of lived experience and research from pretty much every major researcher in the software engineering field. Um, and it is designed to be applicable for every business at every level. I mean, I do even try to go into the things that are important to do first with different levels of resources. And if anybody reads it and they're like, well, had a very small company and this didn't really help me, then I would want that feedback and I can actually clarify it because I know the answers for all those different situations. I just haven't necessarily gotten us to put all of that information into the documents. I tried, but some of it might not be there.
And there's a lot of like research these days around developer productivity. I mean, DORA metrics, space metrics are also some of the things which have been created. How do you think about the interplay of these frameworks in the sense like are they overlapping, are there kind of like clear distinctions, are there like is somebody kind of like really adopting some of those Dora methodologies, can they still find value in your frameworks?
Yes, they absolutely would find value in the framework still. So, for two reasons. One of them has to do with it's important to be able to define your own metrics, and the other one has to do with there's a lot of detail about how to implement the metrics. So, let me talk about both of those. If you talk to the leading experts in this field of measuring and understanding developer productivity, they will all pretty much tell you that the most important thing you need to understand is how to define your own metrics. You can adopt the DORA metrics and they can be very helpful for you in your situation. Um, but the outcomes that you need to have occur for your business, I would say, are more described by the DORA capabilities. Like the things that need to change in your business are more described by the capabilities, which I think not as many people have necessarily gone and looked up. They're on Dora.dev. You can go and read them. They're great. They are a fantastic set of things that would help you improve software engineering and development in your business. But you will also find that the the state that most software development teams are in, as far as metrics go, is they, especially infrastructure and developer productivity teams, is they don't know how to measure their own success. They don't know if their customers are happy with their products or not. They don't know what friction their users, their internal users, are experiencing. And they don't even know how to get out of that situation. And step one is admitting that. It's okay to admit that. None of us, almost none of us at least, went to school for metrics. Almost none of us learned to write or define metrics. We learned to write software, and that didn't come with a background in data science. Um, so you can adopt the DORA metrics, and they can be very helpful. But like, let's say that you own a crash reporting framework. You take all the crashes from your mobile app and you use them. Well, the DORA metrics aren't going to tell you if that app is successful or not. How do you know if your work is successful? And because metrics are most valuable when they drive action. And my experience is the more tailored they are to the specific work that you're doing and the strategic initiatives that you're engaging in and the things that you really care about right now, the more action will be taken on them. So that's really important. And then the other point is, even if you want to do the DORA metrics, the framework will help you understand how to go about implementing those pipelines, or if there's some shortcuts you could take to get some of that data qualitatively through surveys.
When you say like metrics have to be actionable, I would love to double click on this a little bit because maybe two aspects. One is, can you give like more concrete example?
Hmm.
And two could be, what are some of the things that common mistakes that you have heard people have done?
Sure. So let me give you a concrete example of an actionable metric. Today, I'm working on an initiative to make sure that all of our different repositories at LinkedIn build at head. And there's a metric for that. The metric is very straightforward. It's how many of the repositories build at head. We run all their builds every night. And if they pass, then they are green. And if they fail, then they are red. And the metric is called green builds. And that and the it's not just having the number, but it's having a dashboard that lets you dive into dimensions and slice up the data, right? Like we have many, many, many repositories at LinkedIn. And there has to be a way, for example, at first to scope the problem. So we have to be like, okay, let's look at our different language ecosystems. Let's look at Java, let's look at Python, let's look at JavaScript and see how things are different for those different ecosystems and which one we might want to tackle first based on that data. Okay, we've chosen Java based on business impact and the data that we have about that. Okay, so what's causing those failures? Are there groups? Can we group them? Okay, good. Which ones can we fix centrally? Okay, now that we've looked at the data, what's our strategy for fixing that centrally? This is one of the most data-driven initiatives I've ever been involved in. Every single day, practically all we do is be like, okay, what does the data tell us today? Okay, what's the investigation show? Okay, that's our next action. And that's not a metric that anybody's gonna like show up and tell you you should have, because you might not have that problem. Maybe you have one repository. Maybe you want to frame that metric differently. Maybe builds aren't a problem for you. But if they were, that would be the metric you'd want. But we had to know how to define that metric, and not just how to define that metric, but how to define a pipeline that gives you enough dimensions to slice the data with that you can do the investigation.
So it's almost like if I were to compare with software development, it's like not just like tracking errors, but like also debugging what were the root cause of those errors, and creating a framework around that.
100%.
Very cool. So Can you give an example, like counter example, like maybe some folks were just getting started with like developer productivity, developer experience. What is a common pattern or mistake you've seen people do?
Um, so I'm trying to think about specific examples. Okay, okay, I have one. So there's different ways of going about this wrong, right? But one of them is picking a metric that doesn't cause the business outcome that you want. Okay, like let's say there's one that's like you can take action on it, but that action doesn't do the thing you want to have it do. And one of those is CI pass rate. So I've seen companies go like, well, the CI should be passing 100% of the time and it should never fail. Well, if the CI never fails, there's actually something wrong with your tests. Your tests are actually bad. Your CI should fail sometimes. And I have seen people try to optimize CI pass rate to be 100% and then actually have a bad impact on their business. Another common one is people sometimes try to measure engineering flow time before they've measured other things. And to be clear, engineering flow time or focus time is how much time do engineers have available to do work in a day, to do focused work in a day. This is a great thing because you want engineers to have focus time. The concept is valuable. But let's say that I spend 3 to 6 months doing an enormously complicated analysis across the company. I come up with a pipeline and it says engineers have 15 hours a week to focus. Now what? What do I do? What do I do with that? There has to be way more data. You need a lot of the lower, like that metric is not actionable for a reason that the things below it haven't been implemented in the situation that I'm talking about, right? And the most common unactionable metric though is a score, a compound score. So anytime you've like taken a bunch of different metrics and weighted them all and combined them into a single number, and then like it goes up or it goes down, and you have no idea what it going up or down means, and you look at the metric and it's meaningless, and it's really really hard to take action on.
I'm going to switch gears a little bit. There's a lot to unpack, and we don't have too much time. So let's just start with the two concepts that you had around helping understand, like focus time, I think specifically, or like developer productivity, I guess, in some ways. So you had like concepts of iteration time and context switching. Do you want to share like how did you come up with those two specifically, and what does that really mean for developers, and why are those two more critical?
Sure. There are other concepts, and we had a discussion when we were going to publish the framework about whether or not we should include those other concepts in that particular document. We didn't because they aren't necessary to understand the example metrics that I published. But there would be maybe one or two other concepts that I could include. But let's start with iteration time and context switching because they are really important. So in general, software development is a series of observe, decide, act loops. At a large scale or at a small scale. So at a very large scale, you've observed a problem in the civilization, you have decided what you're going to build to solve it, and then you build it to solve it. But of course, within that, I have decided to write a PR. Like I've observed that a PR is necessary. I've decided to write a PR, and I've written the PR, and it's done. But even while you're writing a PR, it's I have observed the compiler failed. I have realized what to do about it, and I have started to code to fix it. So every single thing you do is this sort of loop, this sort of cycle of observe, decide, act within software development. And sometimes people try to just focus on the end-to-end time, like how long does it take from when I have an idea to when that idea reaches production? And yes, that's the outcome that you want. The goal you want is to shorten that time, but also shorten that time and still have like great quality results, right? Like you don't want to reduce the quality of the results. You sometimes even want to increase the quality of the results. And the danger is if you just tell people do it faster, a lot of the time what they do is they just skip iterations that they should have done. They don't run their tests. Like you can just make it faster by just not writing or running tests. You could ship it to production. It won't work, but you can ship it if that's your goal, and in your metrics it'll look like you shipped it faster. So great. And so our experience is, look, those end-to-end metrics aren't useless. They have their value and can be investigated. But the most valuable improvements are in improving the speed of those iterations, because actually improving the speed of that loop, that feedback loop, also improves quality of software. When developers can get results from their decisions, like their actions, when they can get new observations from their actions faster, they will do more iterations, and more iterations lead to a better result almost always. There is a limit. Like as an example, in code review, uh, if you're doing like 3 or 4 rounds of code review, that's actually probably good. If you're doing if you're doing 0 rounds of code review on every code review, that's bad. If you're doing 3 or 4, that actually might be fine. If you're doing 10, that's probably too many. 10 back and forth is too many. So there is a limit, but the limit's very high. Like 10 is an absurd number of back and forths on a code review, right?
I mean, code reviews can also be contentious.
Yes, and that's a whole other topic, and we can talk about that. And there's ways to mitigate that problem as well. And now let's talk about context switching. Um, because software engineering is focus work, it's like you're always like building a mind palace every time you write software. I think every software engineer is like, there's this whole universe that you're creating in your mind as you're coding. And when somebody's like, hey, come and talk to me for 5 minutes, the whole mind palace collapses. And then you turn back over to your IDE and you're like, where was I? And once again, this affects both velocity and quality, because a lot of the time you're like, you actually were in the middle of like, oh, there's a consideration that I have to, like, a lot of the things that I'm thinking about, for example, when I'm developing software are, oh wait, I have to be able to handle this edge case, and I've got to remember to handle this edge case. And sometimes I've been smart and I've written a comment about it to myself because I think I might get interrupted, and sometimes I haven't. Sometimes I have not written a comment to myself. And then sometimes I get interrupted, and then I ship the PR, and then a week later I'm like, oh wait, that edge case that I forgot about, that I was literally thinking about when that person interrupted me. And so and then there's also time. It just takes time to reconstruct all that context. And I've seen studies that say, like a 2-minute interruption or so can lead to 10 to 15 minutes of regaining context. And so it's dramatically disruptive to productivity to interrupt software engineers.
So I want to also double click on both of those a little bit. So does it mean teams should not care about the total time? For instance, like let's just take an example of code review, given that you were mentioning that. Should companies not care about how long it takes to, let's say, go from a code review to merging your changes, um, and only focus on iteration time? Or do you think in some ways both are needed?
I think both are needed, but the iteration time one is way, way more important and way, way more valuable. Like, there are things that only the end-to-end metric will show you. For example, if your changes spend most of their time between being committed and the start of the deployment, fixing iteration time doesn't solve that, except for your deployment iteration time, right? Like, that's like your deployments aren't going out fast enough. That's a different iteration. But if you just focus on like coding time iteration, you'll never notice that. Like, that's like, okay, oh wow, that's like a huge insight. You're like, okay, we need to automate deployment, and that will actually be the most impactful thing right now that we could do to deliver changes faster to developers. But the bad outcome is a manager just looks at the end-to-end metric and tells their engineers deliver faster. That's not a helpful outcome, right? On the other hand, looking at an iteration metric and saying what causes that to be long, and then doing that investigation and figuring that out, improves both quality and velocity.
Okay, and on your context switching, do you have any recommendation? I think, like, especially the example you were giving is like, okay, obviously, if somebody disturbs me while I'm in the middle of coding, I'm going to lose context. I'm going to lose a lot of time. Are there practices that you have adopted, you've seen, or you recommend that help reduce the context switching for developers?
Yes. So there's a few things. One of them is if you have frontline software engineers, you need to be very careful about the number of meetings that you invite them to. Ideally, your tech leads or your managers are shouldering that burden for them instead. And then there can be brief communications either in writing, in emails, in Slack, or if you have to, there can be discussions in a small number of weekly meetings that you control. You do, and it's a thing you need to pay attention to. It can just grow out of control the number of meetings that your frontline ICs are in, and they should not be. Somebody else should be shouldering that burden. Another one is making sure that when there are scheduled events, that they are scheduled in blocks, so that then the time that engineers have is large, continuous sections of open time to do work. Another one is encourage people to turn off all of their notifications. Like, make it very clear when you are coding, you do not do code reviews. You do not respond to Slack messages unless you are the on-call. You do not check your you do not have to respond to your emails. There are no expectations on you when you are coding that you respond to anything. We expect you to quit Slack, to quit Teams, to close your email client. And there's a study from Meta actually that shows that this is one of the most effective things you can do to increase focus time and productivity.
That's amazing. Do you also turn off your Slack when you're coding?
I do.
That's nice. Okay, one other big topic I know I wanted to cover at least from this session was personas. So you had this whole idea around like personas, kind of like when you're focusing on building a team and making efforts in DPH. How do you kind of like cater to different types of people? I would want to at least like from that perspective, like from a generic perspective, right? How do you build a productivity team at like different levels, right? Like you can be an organization of 20 engineers, 50 engineers, and you can be an organization of 5,000 engineers. How do you think about personas at different levels?
Whew, that's a tough one as far as like at a different level. So, when you're a startup and you're just 10 people sitting in a room together, it's really easy. You can just go and talk to people. You just go and talk to everybody who's find out what they're doing, or you just experience their pain, or they just turn to you and they say, hey, Mary, I'm having trouble with this tool. And Mary says, okay, I'll get on that and I'll fix it for you. Like, you don't need personas. You don't need anything. And then eventually you will have significant cohorts of different people who do different types of work. That's really the first time that you need this concept. It's going to be the most apparent, by the way, in the modern engineering companies, the difference between ML developers and software engineers. This is the most striking difference in our personas, for example, that we have at LinkedIn. ML engineers live in a completely different world that has no relationship to most of the software engineering workflow, and productivity teams often have no idea that that's the case, which is pretty amazing. And that's not specific to LinkedIn. Obviously the personas have helped us a lot with that, and I think we have pretty good insight. But I've talked to people in other places where they're just going along with their lives and being like, well, yeah, we write all these traditional software engineering tools, and they don't realize that the people who are producing some of the most value for them as a business are being totally neglected. And you know what? It's not just true for ML developers. Once you have a significant cohort of mobile developers, like if you have even like 2 or 3 or 4 mobile developers, you need to understand the difference between their workflow and everybody else's, because their workflow is unquestionably different. Like the constraints on their releases are totally different. They have to go through the app store. Their rollouts are different. Their builds are different. Their IDEs are different. Everything is different for them. And they might be producing the UI that most of your users use, and you're just making, going along and making all of your tools only for backend developers because maybe you have more of them. But maybe that's not what's actually most important for your business right now.
Awesome. I know there's a lot to unpack there, but I think we're also at time. So I'm going to move on to our very exciting rapid fire round. Are you ready for that, Max?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so what are you most excited about in developer productivity landscape today and in the coming years, months and years?
I'm most excited about the potential of AI to transform how we do software development.
Perfect. That goes to our second question. So, what is your take on AI in improving developer productivity today?
I think it's important to fall somewhere between hype and skepticism. There, and it is important both to realize what it is going to deliver now, for real, actually, and to have some optimism about the future because the technology is improving at an unbelievably rapid rate. And if you fear it and if you resist it, it will destroy your business. So you can go and complain about it all you want. You can be scared about it. You can show up and try to be super skeptical about it and say, well, it's not going to work and it's not going to help me and it's all a lie. And all that will happen is everybody who adopts it will pass you by. On the other hand, you can't just show up and be like, well, I guess it's going to write all the software and maintain all the software and I don't need software engineers anymore because it's not at that state right now. You have to recognize that it can do what it can do. You have to do the investigations, you have to do the experimentation, and you need to encourage people to get over their reluctance and for the things that where it is helpful, really engage because the people who engage with it, their productivity is boosted enormously. And in a and in the world that we live in today, that's an incredible boon.
Awesome. So you've been working in this like developer productivity space for a long time. What do you think makes a great developer productivity engineer? Like, what are some of the traits? Like, I mean, obviously, being a good developer themselves is great, but like, is there something specific that makes them a great DX engineer?
Yeah, I think you have to really want to help other software engineers, not just like there are people who are product engineers through and through. That's what they want to do. They really just want to ship value to users, and that's great. And they should not come and be developer productivity engineers. Uh, you will not be doing that. You will be helping, and you have to want to like be a force multiplier. You have to love being a force multiplier. You have to think, man, if I help this other person do their job better, that means they produce 4 times as much. And like, wow, we can just boom this company by improving the way that it works. That has to sound exciting to you. You have to love that. And you also really want to care, like you have to be a person who cares about how software development is done. Every developer productivity engineer that I work with is a person with a relatively strong opinion about how people should do software engineering.
So having some healthy, strong opinions are good.
Yeah, yeah, or the desire to learn, or like the desire to learn more about it. Because obviously, some people are early in their career and they're going to work on developer productivity. I'm not saying you have to be some software engineering guru to be able to do it. You just have to care about it and want to learn about it and want to make it better.
Are there any kind of like resources you recommend for somebody who's just getting started with developer productivity or want to learn more?
Man, that's such a good question. I wrote a book called Code Simplicity, and the purpose of that book is to explain the fundamentals of the software engineering and the principles behind it to anybody. And the people who've read it who have loved it the most have been people who are just coming into this particular field or this area and who really want to understand what are the most important things that I need to care about. Um, there's a lot of other books that I know that people love, but that I haven't personally read. And so I can't really strongly recommend them. And so I'm not just trying to be self promotional, but that's the thing that I'm the most familiar with in this particular instance.
Awesome. Well, Max, this has been a pleasure. I've always enjoyed chatting with you, but this was definitely fires of information in a very short amount of time. Maybe we need to cover it in a few more future sessions in deeper dive. But thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. Um, hope you had a hope you had fun too.
Yeah, I loved it. Thanks, Ankit.